This is Norma Cardle with the Office of Public and Indian Housing and HUD, and I'm here today with Lori Showman. And we are here today to talk about disaster planning for PHAs. As you know, public housing facilities face some fairly unique challenges during emergency events, and especially because public housing really does need to return to service very quickly to service very vulnerable population. And so we are here today to talk about guidance and toolkits, or a guide and toolkit that has been developed jointly between HUD and Enterprise community partners to assist you in this planning effort. And I mean, it's very true that recovery efforts are made a lot easier when you have a plan in place beforehand that has properly assessed your risks and identified ways to both mitigate them and respond to what happens when you face those risks finally. And we have both climate-related disasters, such as where you're located, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes. We can also have man-made disasters in terms of the electrical grid going down, computer systems going down, fire, arson. So these can all cause a lot of property damage, injure your residents, and disrupt your business operations for an extended period of time. So it's really important to properly assess these before, or at least identify that these are possibilities before they happen. The slide you're looking at right now is a screenshot of the PHA Disaster Readiness and Preparation Guide that just went online last week. And I'm going to go now into a little bit of discussion covering things that I'm sure you all know already about why this is so important, especially for PHAs. Almost by definition, if you are in public housing or in the Housing Choice Voucher program, you are a member of a vulnerable population. Surveys have shown, and I've just discussed one here, is that many Americans really are not financially in a position to just be able to absorb a disaster or an unexpected expense of any kind off the top of their head. For people making less than $30,000 a year, only 23% of the population can handle a $500 unexpected expense out of pocket. 9% of that population doesn't know what they would do. A lot of the rest are saying things like, we will go to family, we will take out advances on credit cards, we have line of credit. But if your plan is relying on members of your family, that depends on members of your family not being strapped for cash at the same time. The average gross income for the public housing and the voucher population is less than $14,000 a year. Half of that population making $30,000 a year. The nearly 2/3 of public housing households, heads of households, are either elderly or non-elderly disabled. Many of those households also have children in them. But the biggest other population that we serve is families with children. Imagine having to replace everything that you own at once. This is an expense that most of us, is a scary thought. But for someone making less than $14,000 a year, it's an almost unsurmountable task. In addition, as most people who operate a public housing program or a voucher program, our housing is supposed to be at the 40th percentile of housing available. There is an extreme shortage of units that are affordable to extremely low-income families. most of those people without assistance couldn't get to the 40th percentile of housing availability. We know that we don't serve anywhere near the number of people that we want to assist, that are eligible to assist. And yet still, public housing and the HUD program is approximately 3 million units targeting people who make less than 30% of AMI. People who can affordable rent is something like 9% of area median income. That housing is a significant asset to the extremely low-income population. So what we've done in the PHA Disaster Readiness and Preparation Guide is that we have talked to PHAs and reviewed continuity of operations plans. We've also talked to HUD staff about the information that, based on their experiences with disasters, the information that they think best assists in the planning process. And we've identified some of the key elements of both pre-disaster preparedness and response, which is that having an emergency preparedness plan and a continuity of operation plan makes the response a lot easier on the PHA and community, and that starts with a risk assessment of what are the vulnerabilities at the PHA and what we can really need PHAs need you to know before anything really happens. For example, these case studies are based on experiences at real PHAs, both of whom did an incredible, phenomenal job responding to a disaster. In this case, we have a PHA that has a portfolio of less than 200 units. And the flooding, there was displaced by flooding, and the flooding was completely unexpected. You know, there was not significant advance warning. Immediately, the PHA staff themselves had been badly affected by the storm, or flooding, I apologize. They responded immediately. They immediately started working with HUD, went out to their insurance companies to get advances on money, figuring out. They found a disaster remediation contractor right away. But because it was a small PHA with only 200 combined public housing units and vouchers, they had limited staffing. And because of the fact that they had no warning, they had an almost total loss, or they had a significant loss of tenant files and building records. And without those records, the PHA staff had to spend a lot of time rebuilding those records. And they also had a hard time getting HQS inspections done as quickly as they would have liked to have done to figure out when they should start abating rent to landlords for units that were completely unlivable, and doing outreach to the local shelters to find out where their population had gone. We had, it didn't displace all 200 households at the PHA, but it affected a lot of them. I think a third of the voucher program was disrupted. So this is a significant burden on both the PHA and all those households, but also on the residents who weren't affected because the PHA was overstaffed. And so if they had a pre-plan in place and taken some steps in advance, it could have really reduced the burden on the PHA staff after the fact, which would have made things a lot easier for the PHA. At another PHA, which had nearly 5,000 units, again, significant impact. 20% of the voucher households were disrupted, but in this case, experience had already been a harsh teacher. They'd lived through hurricanes before, So they were kind of familiar with the process, and because of that, they had, the leadership knew what the staff would need in advance, and they had it in place. They already had good relationships with HUD, FEMA, their local government, the utility companies that they needed to contact. And so they were able to quickly, even more quickly, respond and start to normalize operations again. Now, none of us want to be affected by a hurricane. None of us this is not an experienced teacher. We'd like you not to meet that grading curve starting from an F level. We would like to at least have you have some plans in advance so that when you meet real life experience, you at least have a foundation on which to work. So some of the key points from the disaster readiness guide that we prepared is that you have to start with a risk assessment. You have to really look at all the risks that you face. Granted, alien invasion is probably low on your of risk, but if you're in Tornado Alley or you've been affected by tornadoes, this is an impact. If the local water system is not really well prepared to deal with stormwater flooding and there are routine floods in the area, this is a risk. If you are in a flood zone just in general, this is a risk. If the local utility grid, wind damage brings down even outside of tornado or hurricane, wind damage brings down a significant part of the electrical grid every couple of years. Again, this is a risk. And then you have to figure out what you can mitigate and what you can control and what you simply have to be prepared to respond to. And so, again, we can't move the units. We wish we could. But one of the other key things is communication. Talk to everyone in advance, talk to everyone afterwards. And FEMA has a National Disaster Housing Strategy that lays out some of the steps that you can take in communication. So that's a big thing. Insurance. Figure out what your liability insurance covers, what it doesn't. Do you need supplemental flood insurance? Is there riders that you can get? Do your tenants have enough rental insurance? And finally, train. Train your residents, train your staff, train yourself, train your board, train often. Make sure that your residents know what you expect of them in advance. Make sure you know what you can realistically expect of your residents and staff in advance. And with that, I will turn this over to Lori.
Thanks so much, Nora. That was a great introduction to this training, and also major kudos to HUD for putting together this wonderful disaster readiness preparation guide. Hello to everyone out there. Bear with us for a second because we're going to be switching over to a presentation. Excellent, excellent. Well, good morning, everyone. And for those of you in California and Washington State, we do apologize for getting up so early, but it seemed to be the best time for us, so we owe you one. Enterprise Community Partners is a nonprofit with a 34-year track record of service as a trusted advisor to government and the private sector. We've got a very firm commitment and investment in communities around the nation to ensure that climate-vulnerable homes and communities are able to withstand the impacts of flooding and other extreme weather events. We grant funds, finance development, manage and build affordable housing while shaping new strategies, solutions, and policy. And Enterprise is one of the leading syndicators of the low-income housing tax credit. We syndicate almost $900 million of LIHTC annually, touching thousands of homes and facilitating the investment of private equity and development in this housing. We work closely with public housing authorities around the nation and really want to make sure that those housing authorities are able to sustain the changing climate and extreme weather. So we're really happy to partner with HUD today on this training because it's a really important tool in your asset management tool bucket. So we've got a really great community on the call today. We've got 250 public housing authorities from around the nation on the call today. We just wanted to give you a snapshot of who in our community today of practice. Texas is coming in and having the largest amount of PHAs on the call, followed by Florida. It makes a lot of sense considering Hurricane Matthew. North Carolina, again, flooding in North Carolina has been devastating, and a lot of communities down there are still reeling from the latest floods. Missouri, lots of flooding that was happening there. West Virginia, Louisiana, a lot of communities from Baton Rouge are really struggling to come back online after the devastating floods. Ohio, Colorado, New York, we're actually commemorating the Sandy anniversary today, 4 years after, and then finally Georgia. So I think this is a testament to really the interest and the great awareness now that public housing authorities have around changing climate, and so this is encouraging that we're all here to learn together. So I'm just going to introduce basically today on the call, climate impacts, and then we're going to look at how we start thinking about planning out our strategy. And again, the HUD Resilience and Disaster Preparedness Plan is our general framework. We're going to dive in to try to figure out how we get started. So today, right now, cities and towns around the region, the country, are experiencing national disasters or recovering from them, and we've got unprecedented amount of flooding on the Northeast. Like I said, communities in North Carolina and Baton Rouge are suffering devastating and substantial losses from flooding. This doesn't mention the fires in California or the drought. In fact, this is only in the last 6 months. There have been over 209 major declared disasters in just 3 years. And these disasters require a great deal of support from all levels of government, and the expense to communities is enormous and rising exponentially. We are all realizing just how vulnerable we are, not only to the damage brought by extreme events, but to the long process of economic rebuilding. And as Nora pointed out, it's important that you have your business continuity in place and your asset management practices in place so that you can sustain any losses or any substantial losses that occur. We know that affordable housing is disparately is impacted by floods and extreme weather events. Low-income households have a lot more at stake because they've got a lot less resources to support their recovery. Social services go down. There's less money coming in to support them, and frankly, we have seen disproportionate impacts across the board. There's a lot of work being done to understand how to support low-income communities, but you all are protecting the homes of some of the most vulnerable residents in the country. So it is really critical that you have a plan in place as both their landlord and their and so what we did is we stepped back after Hurricane Sandy and we convened multifamily housing partners from around the region to try to figure out what was needed to support multifamily housing preparedness. And this just gives you an introduction of how we think about the tools that we're going to talk about both at this session and next. Many of our our housing partners consider themselves as social firehouses for preparedness, so that communities come to the housing organizations expecting support, expecting some resource after an event. So we work closely with the multifamily housing community, including our partner, the Jersey City Housing Authority, and I think that JCHA is on the call today, and we really appreciated the input that the Jersey City Housing Authority gave us, and also the leadership that they had after Sandy and through recovery, now building a resilient PHA. So as Nora said, there's two kinds of risks. What are we planning for? We're planning for predicted events. We're looking at events that you can fairly predict 72 hours out. We don't always know the gravity or the severity of the event, but if everyone watches the news or pays attention to any social media, we're now becoming a society that pays attention minute by minute to what's happening to an event, a tornado, a storm. So these are the events that we know are coming up. And then there's the sudden disasters. And these are the disasters that sneak up on us. We've got the fires that happen, or gas explosions. terrorist attacks. We are very familiar with that in New York City after experiencing 9/11. We've got mechanical failures, and this has become a very recent concern for all of us, IT security breaches. How many of your records are on the cloud? Are you able to say that that's a secured place for your records to be? Do you have records that are on the cloud? So there's a lot of risks that could suddenly creep up, and we want to make sure you have a plan in place to support responding. We know that multifamily housing has a variety of uses. So what we found out and what we know working with multifamily housing, and all of you steward mostly multifamily and some single family, we know that these buildings have mixed uses. You've often got an institutional use happening in a building, in a community room, or perhaps a social service. You have residents living in the building. You also may have commercial activity in your building to support use. Many of you just have residential, but you may have businesses that operate in the building. So there's lots of different uses, and this represents a complex ecosystem, and there's lots of needs to respond to. So it's often difficult to figure out the path forward, but this is something to consider when thinking about multifamily buildings. The way we think about preparedness is, for PHAs and multifamily, is three different buckets. First, you've got to protect your buildings. These are your core assets. Many of you dealing with building stock that was built in the 50s and 60s that is often in need of great repair. Often your reserves are limited if you have reserves. You are dealing with building stock that it really needs to be rehabilitated, if not transformed. So these are core assets that you want to protect and have a plan for. You also want to have a plan for your residents. You are dealing with a variety of residents, from the aging in place to residents that require social services, to families with children, and all of these residents have special needs. You may have residents that don't speak English as a first language. You may have residents that are dealing with a variety of challenges. So these are also your critical assets, right? Residents. And then you've got your business to think about. All of you are operating a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week business. So you want to make sure your business continuity is in place and that you can maintain key business operations throughout the disaster. All three of these components are really critical to creating a resilient public housing community, and together that also provides support for your larger community, because you all reside in communities, and having this in place, this kind of support, is important to be the anchor in your community. And so a couple of reasons why we think that it's important to be ready to respond. I'm going to tag team here with Nora. As I said, being ready to respond and being prepared is important because, A, you're reducing your risk to your valuable building assets. This reduces repair and replacement costs. And like I said, many PHAs are operating with minimal reserves, so every extra dollar you put into fixing something is a dollar you're taking away from maintaining something. So it's important to figure out how to reduce that risk and exposure, and reduce the risk to your residents, especially your vulnerable residents, because when those units are not habitable, you're also risking that you won't be reimbursed for those residents as well. So that's an important consideration. Also, residents, as your critical asset, if they are out of a house, you will often be asked to find them something. So you want to be in a position of helping to reduce your risk. Make sure you're ensuring the continuity of your business line during an emergency. There's one PHA we've worked with that lost all their applications for Section 8 vouchers during Sandy, and so that was a major loss for them, and they really lost a lot of time getting their housing leased up. And then you want to establish protocols to track expenses during an emergency so that you can shorten expense reimbursement time from insurance companies. And then finally, establishing confidence in your property management. And as many of you consider building and expanding your portfolio, this also helps to make you a more investment-friendly and more capable property manager. So there's some reasons, these are some of the few reasons that you really should have a plan in place.
So going back to the case study that I was talking about, there are some ways to just kind of address some of the basic problems, which was that lack of staffing caused problems with trying to get HQS inspections for new lease-ups and for the existing units that were damaged, completed in a timely manner. They were having trouble doing outreach and abating rent. If they'd had a cooperative agreement in place among other local PHAs, and one of your best resources is your other PHAs in the state and the region, but if they had kind of a formal or an informal agreement saying, preferably formal, saying to provide assistance during a disaster, then they would have been able to handle these inspections and outreach more quickly, which would have been better for everyone. They lost their tenant records, but they also lost their lead-based and asbestos information and basic data on the building and the construction. And if they'd had these properly stored off-site someplace, then there would have been both data redundancy. They wouldn't have had to have done it all again. They wouldn't have had to have done new testing to find out there was lead-based paint and asbestos in the units during recovery. They could have just proceeded to remediation because they would have known it was there or not there. Again, loss of tenant records, having to reconstruct that from start is just very difficult and time-consuming at a time when you really don't want to be spending. You'd rather be doing things like getting people into new housing and helping them get assistance, and your staff would also probably like to be responding to their own disasters and their own damage to their houses, and you have to make accommodations for that. So, again, your best asset is your people and your time. And the things that you can do to spare burden on both of those things in advance that are reasonably anticipatable is going to make everyone's life easy after the fact.
And in addition to the value of having a plan in place, there's some financial value because we think that resilience and investing in your assets and preparedness is a best practice asset management tool. It's a smart way to manage your assets and to be able to predict what you need and what you are short of. That this should be part of your capital planning process, that every staff member should have in their work scope some kind of criteria and some requirement, and if not a special role that they should play during an event. We also think that using lessons learned from all of your events is an important way to shape your emergency plan. And there's benefit and value, financial value that you can achieve in your utilities when you reduce your load. And we can talk about this on the next session, how you actually achieve resilience in your infrastructure as well. And then in your insurance, it's important to note, as Nora noted before, that there is potential benefit for having a plan in place to potentially get, if you could, some kind of break in your insurance. Although that's something you should be discussing with your insurance broker and make sure that that's something that's possible. But there's a lot of reasons why to have this in place. So let's get started. So in this session, again, we're going to talk a little bit about identifying your hazard exposure, assessing your risk, and determining the strategies to move forward. As Nora mentioned before, we've got lots of different risks that many of us are looking at facing. And again, we have 250 PHAs from around the country on the line today. So many of you have are familiar with some of these risks. Some of you are not. Familiar with flooding. Some of you are dealing with fire out in the West Coast. Fire and drought is a big issue. So flooding comes from stormwater flooding as well as coastal surge. And there are tools to try to understand what your flooding exposure is, which we can walk you through. But flooding is often considered some of the most disastrous risk In fact, flooding accounts for nearly 70% of all federally sponsored disaster programs. So flooding is a very significant issue. It's often much more difficult to recover from flooding because of the amount of damage that happens in the immediate and direct impact as well as the follow-up. With flooding, you always have to make sure you remediate immediately, or there's lots of secondary impacts, and we'll talk about impacts in a minute. Extreme temperature, we know that throughout the country, the moments of extreme temperature are rising. We just experienced a 2-week heat wave here in New York City this summer. Heat waves cause our cooling load to increase. Blizzards cause our heating load to increase, and sometimes what happens is, because all of these systems are dependent on energy, sometimes what that does is that actually we end up having blackouts or brownouts, which creates a whole new emergency. So extreme temperature is a very, very dangerous thing to consider. It also is very dangerous for vulnerable residents. Storm and wind, for those of you in the Gulf Coast and in the Midwest, storm and wind is a very important risk to consider. Tornado Alley, we've got some folks on the line from Oklahoma. Wind is a very dangerous and rising problem, considering the extreme relationship with extreme temperature. And fire, of course, which can come forward from a variety of issues. You can have fires resulting from gas explosion or leaks in a unit. You can have wildfire, and this is a very important and very regulated risk. And then finally, failing infrastructure, and this is something for all of you to consider as you think about your capital planning. What are your assets that are failing and need repair immediately? Because a staircase that is a little bit wobbly can turn into a disaster if it's not fixed in a timely manner, and that exposes you to a host of liability. So failing infrastructure should always be part of your health and safety capital planning process. And in terms of determining some risk, there are some tools out there. So in terms of determining your flood risk or your flood risk related to coastal surge, you can look at the FEMA maps, and they provide you with a sense of what your base flood elevation is and your projected flood elevation going into 2050. Many of you that don't live on the coast, that live by rivers, also have FEMA flood risk maps that you can look at. It's worth hiring a surveyor to determine your base flood elevation and get an elevation certificate. But this is a very key tool in terms of determining what your risk for flooding is. And then, of course, there's community risk. What are the risks to your community? So this is a picture of Jersey City. Again, our partner, Jersey City Housing Authority, is seen in that triangle. And we worked with Jersey City Housing Authority to identify a resilience plan for their Booker T. Washington campus. And one thing that we identified in the process was the actual housing authority sits at the end of a river, a canal, and that canal is at risk of flooding. And when that canal floods, the Booker T. Washington complex is right at the end of the line. And so that was why the leadership at Booker T. and Jersey City Housing Authority thought it was so important to develop resilience plans and took a lot of leadership in this respect, because what happens in your community also impacts your site. So if you have a fire hazard in the community and you don't have community systems in place to mitigate, you are at risk for fire. And so this is really opening up the conversation around what is your relationship to your larger community, and how do you work together with your community stakeholders, your utilities, your planning department, your mayor, your city council, to figure out how to support community-wide protection. And
if I could just say one thing, again, these partnerships are crucial because it allows you an opportunity to, in advance, determine what you and your community agree are your separate spheres of importance. It's very important that PHAs are considered as part of the larger community evacuation plan, and it's important that that's detailed out in advance, and that you know that, because if the community, in fact, had thought that the PHA would handle evacuating its public housing residents, and they would take responsibility for the HCV residents, and you weren't aware of that in advance, then after the fact, or even 72 hours in advance, to suddenly find out that no one seems to know who's supposed to be getting your elderly disabled out of that building is a very scary place to be.
And I would just also like to call out the wonderful federal program that's called the Certified Emergency Response Training Protocol. It's a CERT, and there's CERT communities all over the country, and that's a great thing to offer your staff. In fact, Jersey City Housing has CERT-trained professionals on their staff, and this allows you to relate to the community systems. And again, this is just a FEMA flood map, and I just want to point out that many communities have flood maps, some don't. You want to make sure that you know what your flood risk is, because you're going to want to make sure you have insurance in place to support a flood event. And always, when you're looking at risk, we can't emphasize the importance of including your residents and your online in-place staff in the assessment, because they sometimes will know things that you wouldn't even dream of. And again, you know, this is a picture of the Jersey City Housing Authority team walking through with residents to assess the risk of the site. And you may know the FEMA flood map may tell you what flooding is occurring in one section of the site, but actually flooding may also be occurring somewhere else. So it's really important to understand how to engage your residents and staff in your risk assessment and have them on board as your partners in this. And then why do we want to understand your risk? Well, we want to understand what the impacts are going to be to your residents, your business, your buildings, and your community. And one thing that is important to understand is every risk has an impact. So when you think about residents, an impact to a resident as a result of an emergency event is evacuation, or maybe loss of power. If they're elderly, they can't really go without loss of power, sometimes because they have oxygen needs or they have medicine needs. So there's risks to your residents, and you're going to want to outline what that is, so you have a better understanding of how to support those.
Even if your residents aren't impacted by a disaster, the community surrounding them will be. So it may be that if you have elderly residents, suddenly ambulance times are longer, or supportive services aren't going to be available for the next couple of weeks, and that will impact the quality of their life. So again, even if they're not directly impacted, the secondary impacts of disaster affect everyone in your community.
And then what are the impacts to your business continuity when there's a flood or fire and you lose records, as Nora had said before?
Or office space. You know, if your office space is uninhabitable for a period of time, you know, then you have the whole fun of trying to move and being operated out of multiple locations, which makes everything more complicated.
And what that might translate to is also a loss of income and loss of funding. So when you don't have your records in place, when you go in for reimbursement from either your insurance company or FEMA or some other source, you may not get reimbursed. So that's really important. So impacts to your business continuity, and then impacts to your buildings. What happens if there is a fire at your building and you lose units? Recovering those units is very difficult. Also, recovering the systems in the buildings can be very difficult. If your boilers are flooded, rebuilding those boilers can be very challenging. And if you have the unfortunate situation where your business continuity has gone down, how are you going to get the money to repair your buildings?
What if your commercial space is affected? I know a lot of PHAs have space that they rent out to businesses or other community factors, and if you're depending on that rent and suddenly that building is disrupted, or you need to take the space back because other space in buildings has been destroyed and you can't use it, then how is that going to affect your financial picture? And how that all affects your recovery?
And then finally, the community is impacted when the PHA goes down. And so what are the impacts to your community? And Nora aptly said that there's impacts that happen in the community, to pharmacies, to businesses, to first responders, and you want to understand what those impacts are.
And also, when the community is impacted, the rental market, especially for people who are in ACD programs, the rental market becomes incredibly distorted. So that impacts your ability to A, house your tenants, B, even find commercial space to rent out if you need additional commercial space. So having that in the back of your mind is something really that helps in your long-term planning process. But you could suddenly find yourself in an incredibly different rental space market than currently exists.
So why are we doing all of this? Why are we so committed to this work? I mean, this is why. Because you have you are protecting hundreds and thousands of units around the country that are providing safe and healthy homes to women like this. And this is a picture from the recent North Carolina floods. Or young children and single moms that home is everything to them. And this is a recent picture from Baton Rouge. And we're seeing more and more of these pictures come through. And it is so critical that the folks that have the ability to develop plans to protect these vulnerable residents are working on that. And so there are strategies. And in the next session, we're really going to talk about some of the strategies and really roll up our sleeves and talk about how to start doing the work. And, you know, there are strategies that we're going to talk to you about your disaster staffing, and all of this is framed by the excellent guidance that HUD just released on disaster preparedness. We're going to talk about how to run a tabletop exercise and what kind of tools you can provide to your residents to get them online, and how to build up your emergency plan from the ground up, working with your staff hand in hand. We're also going to talk about different strategies to improve your building and resilience. We're going to talk a little bit about how to think about capital planning and ways of supporting your infrastructure so that it can be better able to withstand the impact of a variety of events. And I'm going to mention our partner, Jersey City Housing Authority. They went through a very visionary process to understand how to build a more resilient public housing community at their Booker T site. And they came up with some really great ideas in terms of how to manage the stormwater and develop resiliency at the site and at the housing. And so all of this is to say that there's lots of strategies out there that we are looking forward to trying to figure out with you. But again, understanding what we're planning for is the most critical step. So on our next session, we want you to come to the table with a sense of what you're actually planning for so that we can roll up our sleeves. And, you know, we have developed a survey for you to take that will enable you to understand what your readiness needs are and where you can start planning. And so it's a 10-minute survey. It's online, and we'll send you the link. We'd like you to take that between now and next training, and then on the next training, we are going to give you the results of the community. So this is your homework, and the incentive for taking this is that on the next training, you'll understand what the needs of our community, the Public Housing Authority community on the call is. You also get a customized report of your own, and then next session, we're going to be really diving in again to talk about the strategies and talk about the specifics. And here are the website links to both the Disaster Readiness and Preparation Guide as well as our tools for resilience. I think at this point, we're going to open up to questions from the community. So, Donna, let's get started.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Lori. Just a reminder that if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the Q&A box, which you should find on the lower right-hand side of your screen. And we will be happy to take them. We've already gotten a few questions about the availability of the slides and the webinar recording, and that will be sent out to all participants once the recording is ready. And at that point, we'll also be including a link to the survey that Laurie was just mentioning. And I'm waiting to see if we get any new questions in. Okay.
Now, if anyone has any questions about how to determine your risk, we would also be curious if anyone on the call has any experience they'd like to share with us in terms of how they've started doing their planning work or experience from a recent event that they would like to share with us.
Okay. We've got actually, let's see, I'm looking for more questions. Here we go. Wayne would like to know, should business continuity plan be very detailed as it relates to potential events?
It depends on what the levels of your risk are. Certainly, your plan should cover basically worst case scenario, how you continue to your planning to operate. So, for example, in general, do you have a plan in place to relocate if necessary? Who is your first line staff? Who will have what responsibilities? It doesn't be by name, you know. It does not necessarily have to be, and John will be out here, but it should be like we will expect maintenance staff, or maintenance staff will do this. This is where our emergency supplies are operated. If we lose all computers, et cetera, this is how we're going to keep in touch. It doesn't have to be customized to exactly, this is what we will do in case of a hurricane. This is what we will do in case of a hurricane hitting next door. This is what we will do in case of flood. It can be, this will be what we will do if a building needs to be evacuated. This will be what we will do if our offices, for whatever reason, are inaccessible. You know, this is where we will coordinate. This is where the emergency site is. This is where we expect everyone to go. You know, this is where, barring this site not being available, you can find us here after a disaster. If we cannot be here, you know, we will communicate that to you. So, for example, if the answer is everyone will gather at the community building at our main site on Georgia Avenue. If the site on Georgia Avenue is not available, we will call you. That is, for example, you know, part of a continuity of operations plan.
And one thing we're going to talk about on our next call is how to develop a business continuity plan. We've developed a framework to staff your emergency response based on the incident command system that FEMA works with, as well as every first responder around the nation. And we have different positions for different functions, which we'll talk about next week. But in the business continuity function, we would advise that there's a business continuity coordinator, and that they would be overseeing IT function as well as a human resource function. Within the business continuity coordinator, you know, work checklist, you're going to want to make sure you've got your insurance needs taken care of, your shutdown and reopen needs, your reimbursement protocols in place. As Nora said, you want to make sure you have your headquarter location in place. So there's a whole checklist of items that you want to make sure you have at baseline.
Including information on if you know of a good disaster mitigation, construction contractor, you know, who are your insurance agents, who do you call to shut off various power things. That's part of your business opportunity and continuity is like, who at the utility company do you get called to shut it off? who at the utility company do you get called to get it turned back on at the new location or whatever. These are the types of things that are kind of standardized to most large-scale disasters and should be under the purview of your business continuity coordinator.
As well as having how to get cash out to your frontline staff. So these are all critical things to think about in advance. You don't want to be thinking about them when you're dealing with the event. And right now on the screen, everyone, I have a piece of the Ready to Respond business continuity section. So we'll be going over that at our next training. And at our next training, we're going to be going over how to develop your framework with your organization, staff, the different sections that are important to have in place for the disaster preparedness plan, and then what tools are able to support each staff member to do their job during the emergency. And I'll just say one more thing while we're waiting for more questions. You know, this is a best practice asset management tool, having an emergency plan in place, and you can use the plan to help you support other functions of your asset management. So, you know, some of the things we'll be talking about next week and advising you on is collecting, you know, all of the nameplate data for your equipment, putting it in one place so that you know if you have to reorder a part, you can go to that catalog and you know what part to order, and you don't have to go down to the building and take a look at the boiler or the heating unit. And that if you have all of your resident names and their needs in one place, you can better program your community center or your offer a program to support your residents. Maybe connect them to a social service, and that's something that the residents would appreciate.
Right. Again, if you have emergency contacts for some of your building managers, know that there are some people who will need additional help in an evacuation, not going into the nature of what their need might be, but saying, yes, we're pretty aware that this person has a mobility challenge and will need some extra help getting out of the building. Having contact information, if some of your residents choose to provide it, saying, do you have emergency contacts we should contact for you in case something happens? Encouraging your residents to have medical alert bracelets detailing their medication needs so that in case, you know, they evacuate or things like that, someone can look at it and say, okay, these are the refills that we need to get for your tenant.
And this is all going to be helpful to you as you move forward and run the authority, and you can get creative with this. It can be an exercise to help build community with your residents, letting them know that you're going through the emergency planning exercise. You can also help facilitate community leadership. We've seen in some examples that resident teams are developed with floor captains so that resident leadership is acknowledged for their strong work, or they're able to take a leadership position and help you support the community.
And your residents probably know each other better than you do. So your residents will probably be the ones to know in their communities who is going to need additional help, or who has situations that have changed that maybe have not yet been shared with the leadership. You know, there's a new person coming to visit them, you know, they have a new health aide, or they're getting additional social services, and that these are things that need to be maintained. You know, someone may have gone from not needing oxygen to needing oxygen, and that may be something that a neighbor knows, but you don't. And so encouraging them to be part of the planning process and to really be part of the response process for both their sake and your sake can be very powerful.
Okay. Yeah, we've gotten some good questions in. We may not get to them all, but I'll make sure that our panelists have copies of all the questions so we can get back to you offline. A question from Daniel, which is, what are HUD's expectations of public housing authorities in a disaster? What support or resources can we expect from HUD?
Well, okay, so this plan is not a mandatory submitted document. This is really just, we encourage you to do this, we encourage you to do it for you. The expectations of you in a disaster and the amount of support and resources that we can give you is really actually very situation dependent, so I don't want to give a blanket answer. Certainly, we are there to help, as much as we can. We encourage you to, reach out to your field office the minute something happens, and we'll take it from there. That's really an interactive decision on the field level.
And next week, we're going to have a representative from FEMA to talk about the Stafford Act and to talk about the kind of support that FEMA provides to PHAs during an event. Okay. Next question.
All right. Next one is actually more of a comment, but Linda says, to prepare, we started sitting in on our regional EOC meetings and helping them understand who we serve, our resources, and what we'll need in a disaster. They had no idea that we did not have vacant units they could use for emergency housing.
Yeah, that's very important to say, yes, we don't have additional units. Our vacancy rate is very low, and what we have is non-habitable or has been repurposed for something else. That's a very good point, and I will make a note of that.
Okay. Domingo would like to know, do you have any recommendations for mass notification platforms or programs? In other words, mobile alerts to cell phones.
Well, that's a great question, actually. We're going to talk about communication in the next training, but I'll note that we'll talk about some of the communication templates that we've developed based on input from our multifamily housing partners to help you with your social media messaging, with your messaging to residents, as well as your messaging to funders or investors or, boards or chief stakeholders. So I do want to say, it's really important to get your communications down because as all of us now know, you can get reports on someone and something by the second. And so it's important that you have your unified messaging together because when an event hits, you're going to have residents going onto Twitter or social media, and you want to make sure that you're able to have a unified message, at least from the PHA's perspective. There's a lot about liability and exposure after an event, especially if someone's been hurt. So you want to protect yourself and have one person really appointed to steward that. And we're going to talk about that next week.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and it is from Liz, and that is, should a plan be available to the public?
That depends. I would say that your residents should know what the plan is, but these are mostly internal documents for your benefit. So, again, it's not necessarily a public document unless for whatever reason a PHA thinks it's in its best interest to make it a public document. For example, I think NYCHA's document is probably public because NYCHA is 140,000 units. But it's really the PHA's document. You own it, you control it, it's for your benefit. It's what you want your staff to know, what you want your residents to know, what you want your community to know in case of a disaster. So I have no formal opinion on that subject except for the fact that it is an internal document for you.
Okay.
Well, with that said, I think we're going to close out this session. We look forward to speaking with you all again next week. We want you to take the survey, and please go to these links so that you can get a better understanding of what we're going to cover. Come to the table with some questions. Let us know what your risks are, and then we will see you again next week at this time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. This ends today's webinar. We will see you again on the 3rd. Goodbye.